Welcome back to another edition of the Hart2Heart Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Colin Wright. He's an evolutionary biologist and he's also a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. So, Colin, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for the invite. I appreciate it.
So, Colin, I did give the audience there, just a little bit of, history about you. You're an evolutionary biologist. You're working at the Manhattan Institute as a fellow. But maybe you could just give the audience just a little bit more of a brief background about yourself.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I was an actual academic biologist until 2020. Don't need to get into major things that happened, but there was, a major cancellation attempt because I started talking about the biology of sex. I had a lot of colleagues saying that sex was a spectrum, or that, there's more than two sexes, or that sex is a social construct, that type of stuff. And I was kind of one of the early biologists to speak up against this and write some articles for the public, and some for major outlets like the Wall Street Journal that went super viral. And so I started off just sort of getting into the biology of things, just trying to correct the record on biology. And then that opened the door to what other things does this touch upon? Well, this also touches upon, males competing in female sports. This touches upon gender pediatric medicine. And so I've just sort of looked at the various ways that this type of sex pseudoscience is infecting so many areas of society. And now I work at the Manhattan Institute, specifically going after the policies and trying to get sort of the laws changed about how we define sex in law, rather than rooting it in gender identity and so on. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. I'm all about the biology and debunking the pseudoscience of sex and gender that's out there. But I also comment on other things too, like DEI and issues with academia and peer review and things like that. So yeah, that's kind of what I do.
So we're now in November 2024. When did you first start encountering, the articles about gender ideology, and when did you push back?
I first started seeing articles probably around, I would say, 2013, just subtly sort of suggesting that sex wasn't real, but they're always kind of equivocating between sex and gender. So I always assumed that maybe I was missing something. And then there was an article in Nature in 2015 by Claire Ainsworth that was called Sex Redefined. And the subtitle was, why biologists now think sex is much more complex than just male and female. And it was this article in Nature, again, the most prestigious scientific journal in the world, that was basically arguing that there are more than two sexes, or that sex is a spectrum and a social construct. And so that's when I realized that this wasn't just, some people on campus, some corners of academia. This was kind of mainstream now. And then other publications like Scientific American started doubling down on this. Discovery, Wired Science, everyone was going all in on this. And it was annoying me for several years until I published an article in Quillette called The New Evolution Deniers. And that was in 2018. But it was something I'd been sitting on. I was currently a postdoc at Penn State at the time, and I wasn't tenured. And so I kind of sat on this essay for a while because I feared that I would just get totally canceled. And it turns out they were correct, but, I couldn't live with myself as a biologist who was being unable to say true things about biology. And so I eventually just sent it in, got it published. And I've really just been focusing on that and related issues ever since.
And so what was the thing that really got your attention? Was it that you felt that, it was the puberty blockers? Was it the just the fact that people were saying that it's more than two genders? What was the thing that really kind of got you up to say, okay, I need to start doing something about this because this is kind of getting out of control?
There were a few moments, I think. I think early on, again, I just had a scientific problem when I heard people talk about, they would quote Anne Fausto Sterling saying that there's 5 sexes, or they'd say that sex is a spectrum, there's an infinite number of sexes, or it's just sort of a statistical thing. You can just be more or less male, but not male or female, or that it's just a social construct. It doesn't even exist at all. And so my background is in evolutionary behavioral ecology. I studied social behavior in wasps and spiders, and just the whole literature about animal behavior. Really, we get a rigorous understanding and training in the biology of sex, because some of the biggest differences in behavior within a species and patterns across species has to do with sex differences, because of the different reproductive strategies that males and females have. There's very predictable ways that they behave. And if you're not accounting for it in your data, then your data is going to be a complete mess. It's important for the ecology of countless species. So my initial pushback was just like, wow, people are really, people with PhDs, biologists, are really getting it wrong about what sex is. Again, it was just people are wrong about science. And so when I pushed back, it was purely scientific disagreements. But then what I got back as criticism, expecting, what scientists usually are expecting, like, oh, you're wrong on this point. This, maybe this, it's not binary because, oh, here's this other sort of sex cell that was found. It's just some sort of scientific argument, but it was all, you're like a vile transphobe. You're parroting far right talking points. It was just all of this stuff that had nothing to do with science. It was just, took me by surprise. And then I kind of realized, I was like, well, where is this coming from? And then when I looked under the hood of sort of where this sex denialism is coming from and the literature around gender identity, I just realized that this wasn't just a scientific thing. There was a huge political apparatus. There had been momentum building in this sort of ideological communities for decades. And I'm just seeing the outcroppings of the insanity sort of first, getting over the fence into the biological sciences. And then, it was a second sort of reckoning that I had when I realized, oh, they're using this idea of the sex being a statistical thing that can be changed with hormones and surgeries as a justification for giving children, to blocking their puberty and to giving them cross-sex hormones. But if they can't really change sex because sex isn't a spectrum, then like the whole premise for this type of medicine, medicine, scare quotes, it's just unsound. There's no premise whatsoever. So maybe we shouldn't be doing this if the justification we're giving is completely false. And so that was another thing. It's just, not only is it just scientifically wrong, but it's being used to sterilize and alter children with hormones and surgeries that are completely irreversible. So yeah, there's a few moments where it's just like, holy crap, what is going on here?
So I want to come back to the puberty blockers in a sec and, the surgeries, but regarding like your field and your profession. So, you're one evolutionary biologist, but there's got to be many more out there. So what was the reaction from some of your colleagues?
So the
Like, are they
initial,
also up in arms about this, or?
I had some of my close mentors, they were aware of the problem when I gave them my essay, the first one I wrote for Quillette in 2018. They both told me that this was a fantastic essay. It's completely correct, every line of it, and they're sort of applauding it along as they read it. But both told me that I shouldn't publish this, or at least I shouldn't put my name on it. I should publish it under a pseudonym, because they realized that this was, poking a massive political bear that I maybe, given my precarious position at the time as a postdoc, that said like, this wouldn't be good for your career to do this. And so, yeah, that was what I got from the people closest to me. But then a lot of colleagues surrounding me, they either thought that I was confusing sex and gender, which I wasn't, because I've always made sure these things are clear. And I never got, it didn't anger me when people were talking about, a spectrum of gendered expressions and things like that. Like, clearly that's the thing. It was really when they were making these claims about biology. So the first, I guess, reaction of them was to sort of insist that I'm just missing the point. I'm sort of missing something. And then the second thing they did was, to accuse me of parroting these far right talking points, them somehow emboldening the right wing or Trump supporters specifically in this. And to me, like, I was never a very political person. I had voted Democrat for my entire life. But I mean, science for me was always just about what's true. I didn't care about what could be used against me or a certain political side. I just wanted to say true things about biology, and so that's what I was trying to do. But no, the backlash was really, really intense within my field. I mean, people were posting on job boards that everyone in my field looks at that I was a transphobe and a race scientist. They just throw sort of racism accusations in there too for the hell of it. And they were calling departments ahead of time to make sure that they wouldn't hire me, and it was a complete mess. So yeah, it got really bad.
It's so odd though, just because like, you're an evolutionary biologist. So, this is literally your field of expertise. and it's supposed to be the field of expertise, obviously, of all evolutionary biologists. So you would assume that, if you're seeking the truth, you would come to the conclusions that you've come to, and that other people would support you in the community. But it seems like you weren't really supported by your colleagues at all. And in fact, it was the complete opposite, and you were canceled and backlashed, and they seemed like they made it a very difficult time for you overall. I mean, are there any other evolutionary biologists who feel the same way as you do?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's plenty. I hear from them through DMs, through emails, that they understand, what's going on. But either there's always an excuse why they can't really say anything themselves. For me at the time, it was, oh, I was a grad student beforehand, and it's like, maybe when I get my postdoc, I'll write this article. And then I'm a postdoc. It's like, well, I'm still not tenured. Maybe when I get a job, I'll do it. And then you get their job, and then it's like, well, maybe when I get tenure, and then you get tenure, and then it's like, well, maybe, I need to apply for grants still. And, there's always a reason you can kick the can down the road. And I kind of realized that early on. And so I just decided to just go for it. Which ended up paying off. But, there's other people like Jerry Coyne, for instance. So some of the best and the brightest and my heroes in the field, who are unable to be canceled, are the ones that have really been my biggest allies in this. Jerry Coyne, he's now professor emeritus at the University of Chicago. He's just one of the most legendary evolutionary biologists at the time, who's still alive. And then Richard Dawkins, he's now talking about this stuff, and he's sharing my lectures on Twitter and things like that. So I'm getting confirmation from the absolute best
Congratulations on
people.
that. That's awesome.
Yeah, I actually got to interview him in Portland about a month ago, which was wild, because he's been a hero of mine. So more biologists are being emboldened to speak out against this. There was just a huge social cost for doing it very early on, because people could see what happens to those, like Heather Heying, Brett Weinstein's wife. She was canceled big time. My friend Emma Hilton, she spoke up. They went after her. Fortunately, her university stood by her for this. They went after me. They went after Carol Hooven. And so people just, especially if they're not tenured, it's just, they're focusing on their area of research, what might not having anything to do with sex, even if they understand what that is. And it's just like, why would they just voluntarily introduce all of this headache into their life that could derail their whole careers, when they can just keep studying the genetics of tadpoles or whatever they're doing, and live a happy life? So yeah, it's all about the incentives, I guess. And fortunately, now we're in a better spot where more and more people can talk about it.
And so let's just talk a little bit about, gender affirming care. And there's a study that I want to bring up. It was done in 2022. I forget the name of the study now and the authors, but we can certainly link it to the show notes after. But you're probably going to know which one I'm talking about. Maybe you know the data on this better. But from my understanding, people who identify as transgender when they're in their adolescence or as a child, about, I think it's 65% or 63%, something like that, just end up being bisexual or gay. And then I think 15% ended up, actually becoming or staying transgender when they're an adult. And then, I'm fudging up the numbers here a little bit. And then the other remaining part actually just ended up remaining heterosexual when they were older. So, they didn't want to change sexes, and they like the opposite sex. So, that's less than 1 out of 5, right? When you're talking about, what happens to these people, right? So, I mean, when you discuss, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that study or those particular figures, but like when you bring this up to other people, people in your field, like what do they say about that? Like how can you, basically like how can you just keep performing these surgeries, keep giving kids puberty blockers when you know that, it's only going to be the right thing potentially for about 15% of those people?
Yeah, no, I do know that study. There's several studies that all sort of corroborate that general figure. And honestly, the people who I interact with on this, they do not engage with those types of facts. So there's this quest among people who, I call them gender ideologues, people who support the gender identity ideology, where you have this case where you have like adult people who have transitioned, and they think to themselves, oh, wouldn't I be so much happier now if I had been able to have puberty blockers when I was younger, I would pass much more. Now I wouldn't have to spend tens of thousands of dollars on all these cosmetic surgeries and I have. And so because these people are convinced that, they would have had a better time if they would have been allowed to transition early, this puts them on this quest of like, well, we need to be able to find those kids who we know will eventually transition and who, for their entire lives. The only problem is like maybe you can, the hindsight's always 2020. You can always know if, this would have been the right choice for you potentially. When you look back and you say like, well, I've lived my life as a trans woman and this I would have preferred if I had, been able to have puberty blockers. But the issue is that you can't tell these kids apart early on before they go through puberty, which ones are most likely to end up maintaining their trans identity throughout their entire life. It's impossible to do. And so when you try to do this, you might be able to get, 10%, more than pure chance of which ones are more likely to do this. But the types of traits they look for are the same traits that you would expect to see in kids who grow up to be homosexual, high degrees of gender nonconformity, girls who are involved in a rough and tumble play who don't, play with Barbies, they play with trucks, just sort of these types of things. And so you have all this bycatch. Then the question is like, well, how much bycatch, how much collateral damage, how many kids are you willing to give puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and surgeries to, who would have otherwise desisted and not maintained this trans identity for the rest of their lives? And then we get to the whole question of, well, is there actually evidence of benefit for these types of procedures, like long-term benefit, not just, immediately after your surgery, you kind of have this euphoric period of, you got what you've been wanting. And the answer is, and we have now several systematic reviews on this, is that there is no good evidence to support the use of puberty blockers, of cross-sex hormones, of surgeries for adolescents that says that they actually lead better lives. So this is turning into like a kind of a massive experiment on kids. And it turns out that usually going through puberty is what makes people desist, what makes people become comfortable with their body, become okay with their gender nonconformity. And also the environment, the social environment helps. If people are not, kids are pretty cruel and they tease people who aren't conforming to, kind of strict gender roles and things like that. So we really just need to sort of pause this whole project of pediatric gender affirming care. I'm open to adults if they want to take, if they want to go through the steps and have body altering cosmetic surgeries. I have no problem with that, but I don't think we can pretend that this is medically necessary life-saving surgery. I think we need to actually stick to the evidence-based medicine on that, which really shows that there's no good evidence that these are life-saving or lead to better life outcomes generally, especially for kids.
And on that note too, I mean, there was a study that came out, I think it was at the beginning of this year sometime, and it was on suicide, and it was on, adolescents or people. I'm not sure if it was just adolescents or if it was adults only or adults also in that study, but it said that people who had undergone gender affirming surgery, like they were like, I forget the quote, but it was like 10 to 20 times more likely to commit suicide. Like it was an incredibly high number. So can you speak on anything with regards to, people who do go through with this surgery and the impact it has on their mental health afterwards and whether their mental health improves or deteriorates?
Yeah. So the biggest issue is that we just don't really have the good long-term studies that are controlled. I know the study you're talking about, but the issue is often what they're comparing these groups to is sort of the general population rather than other individuals with similar mental health issues like depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, that see if people with the similar cohort of mental health issues are more likely to commit suicide versus people who identify as trans who often always have some of those same comorbidities, those mental health issues. And so it's hard to know, is it because they transitioned or is it just because that they have severe mental health issues? Because when you look at just people who have severe mental health issues, they also have high instances of suicide attempts and completed suicide. So, I mean, by and large, and this has been bared out in the systematic reviews, is just there's just not good evidence either way on this. And then when you take into account the fact that, well, these surgeries, these things, well, they're irreversible. They change your body, and they're also sterilize you for a lifetime. It's not just we need some evidence of benefit. We need overwhelming evidence of benefit to counteract the known harms, these very serious things that happen to your body. Because I don't think people should downplay what it means to sterilize someone, especially at a very young age. Who, maybe when they're 11, they're probably not thinking about a family that they want to have. Me personally, I didn't want a family until I turned about 35 years old, and now I'm very much focused on having a family. So, people change, people's wants and likes change. We can't take an 11-year-old's word for it regarding their position with respect to how they're going to want to have a family later in life, and also just pretty much anything when you're 11 years old. I mean, they're so in flux. Their identities are forming. They're going through puberty. There's so much changing in their lives that they need some stability. They need to be told that these feelings are natural. You're just going to be able to go through puberty, and everyone sorts things out, and no one has just like a really breeze through puberty and don't have any sort of type of mental crisis halfway through. I mean, it's extraordinarily common. And what the gender ideology does is it tries to pathologize these normal feelings of puberty and identity searching as evidence that you may have been born in the wrong body, that you have a male brain and a female body, or vice versa, that can be corrected. We can change your body to match your brain through hormones and surgeries and that type of thing. Which for me, it seems kind of like almost like a gay conversion therapy in reverse. We talk about gay conversion therapy where people are, undergo these psychological interventions to try to make their brains match, their body. And the gender medicine is just kind of going about it the opposite way, because these kids are overwhelmingly going to grow up to be homosexual adults. And what the gender-affirming surgery says is we're going to change your body to match your brain. It's just two ways of arriving at the same endpoint.
And so for people who don't know, gay conversion therapy is when people who are gay, they go to therapy and then the therapist tries to convert them to heterosexual. And then you're comparing that now to people who are transitioning, they believe they're male or believe they're female. And then we're using, instead of psychology, we're using biology, we're using tools like surgery to convert their sex from male to female or from female to male. So it's actually kind of interesting. I've never heard someone point it out like that before, or making the comparison from, transitioning to from transitioning to just conversion therapy. Talking about transitioning too, what have been your experiences and thoughts on detransitioners, and have any detransitioners reached out to you and said, I really appreciate the work that you're doing? Can you speak a little bit about the detransitioners that are out there?
Yeah, I've fortunately got to know a lot of detransitioners. They're like the most interesting group of people you'd probably ever meet. They're so wise beyond their years, partially because a lot of them are kind of on the autism spectrum, and so they have just they have this profound nature to them. They're often highly intelligent as well. And then they've gone through a lot of, they've lived a lot of life in a very short amount of time, because they had to deal with these sort of mental health crises. They've gone through transition and back again. This causes a lot of introspection. So these are some of the most interesting people, and you'll ever meet. But they all have a very similar story. They somewhere on the autism spectrum. This comes with a lot of different things, like often sex nonconforming behavior, especially in females, is correlated with being on the autism spectrum. The sort of black and white thinking, these having a special interest that they just get obsessed with. And we see a lot of them, they got obsessed with sort of gender ideology, with trying to find out who they were and what their gender was. The autism also usually makes them kind of feel alienated from their peers, because they're a little odd sometimes. They're socially not very savvy. And so this creates feelings of isolation. And then the gender activists, they use all this feelings of anxiety and like you don't fit in and your gender nonconformity to tell you that this is evidence that you've been born in the wrong body. And so that's what happens to these kids. And I've gotten to know a lot of them, and all their stories are just, they're just like cookie cutters. You're like, let me guess, you had autism. Let me guess, you went onto an online forum and you started talking to people about gender stuff. You went to a doctor. Let me guess, they told you that would you rather have a living son or a dead daughter type of thing, scaring them with suicide, scaring them and their parents that they're likely to commit suicide if they don't transition. And these are events, though, that they should not happen. We never saw this number of detransitioners in the past, because if you talk to the older generations, people of Generation X and even older millennials who did go through some sort of transition, is that there used to be a lot of medical safeguards in place where they would make sure that you need to sort of, live as the opposite sex, however you want to, interpret that, for, a year or more. Sometimes you need to, undergo these intense evaluations of your mental health. But we've since moved away from any types of medical safeguarding to just a self-identification where the patient leads the entire process. You can't be questioned by any doctor about your gender identity. And it's become just, you're offered a list of surgeries that you want to that are all covered by insurance, and you just, check the boxes down the line. I wrote a story about a woman named Beth Bourne, and she was like a 57-year-old woman, and she wanted to see how easy it would be for her to access this stuff. And so she just told the doctors, that I want to change my pronouns on my medical intake forms. This then triggered a lot of responses back, like, oh, we see you're talking about your gender identity, that type of stuff. And, here, have a Zoom meeting. And she talked about how, oh, she's just sort of always been very tomboyish, and maybe I could sign up for a double mastectomy. And there's just, okay, here's we need to do a mental health check. And it was no such thing as a mental health check. It was just all affirming and, what you want. We're not here to be gatekeepers. We just want to, make sure that we get you exactly what you want. Within a few months, they approved her for a double mastectomy. Within another couple months, they approved her to have a phalloplasty, to make a artificial penis out of her forearm. There were no roadblocks any step of the way in this entire process. You can just access these, at will. And this is why we're seeing so many kids, so many people detransitioning, is because no one told them truth about biology, that you can't actually change your sex, that it's okay to be a sex nonconforming individual, that there's such thing as masculine girls and feminine boys, and that's totally fine. They were just convinced by this sort of totalizing ideology that told them that you can literally be born in the wrong body. So yeah, that's where we're at now.
So maybe what we should do then, Colin, is compare the care of transitioning to detransitioning, because it seems like if you want to transition, you're welcomed with open arms. If you are trying to detransition, you're not welcomed with open arms. Because you just said, like, you went through that story of that 57-year-old lady, like within a few months, like booked for a double mastectomy, getting like a new penis. Like, those are insanely big changes. Like, we don't do that. Like, we don't even just put people on, even like stimulants, sometimes in that short of time. Like, I have to refer someone generally to like a psychiatrist if I want to put someone on a medication like that. And these are like, life altering things that, are going to affect you in the immediate, in short term, but also consequentially in the long term, forever.
Yeah.
And to make that decision within 2 to 3 months is just absolutely insane. So how do you compare that level of care and expediency and acceptance towards someone who is trying to detransition?
They couldn't be further apart in terms of the care that's received. Well, I use care. I don't know if I'd call it that. So when you're trying to transition, that's, you're given this diagnosis. Well, you're self-diagnosed as having a gender identity that does not match your body. And once you just make that claim, then all the doors open for you in the direction of transitioning. But because detransitioners no longer have a gender identity that doesn't match their body, all the surgeries they're trying to access are just deemed like cosmetic surgeries. Like if you just wanted to get, like a breast augmentation as a woman, okay, because there's no dysphoria anymore. And so they don't get to access even surgeries to reverse surgeries that they've had when they transitioned. Like I've known males who had gone through and transitioned and got breast implants, and they're stuck with their breast implants because their insurance won't cover their removal. It would only cover getting them because at the time they had the mismatch between their gender identity and their, they would say sex assigned at birth, but it was their actual biological sex. So it's just this complete, like, hall of mirrors that you walk into where just by a mere different way that you think about yourself, suddenly all those doors to detransitioning are closed. And then shockingly, like there's been bills, I went to one of them here in Nashville, where it was called a detransitioner Bill of Rights that was trying to be passed, just to extend the same type of care for transitioning to detransitioners, just so they can similarly access these types of things if they've made a wrong decision. And there were gender activists that were protesting this, merely because they want to ignore the detransition problem, because Chloe Cole was there, who's a prominent detransitioner who speaks out against these procedures, and that they were literally trying to protest and get this bill killed that would have only extended the care to people who were detransitioning. So it's become completely ideological and tribal at this point. And we're hoping that with the new administration coming in, we'll be able to put the people who are giving these types of care, this surgery, this gender-affirming care, put them on the hook for anyone that they transition who decides to detransition. Because right now, there's just nothing. They're not on the hook for any of these things. So there's no incentive for them, to use any type of caution whatsoever, because, they'll get money on the front end when they transition them, and then they're going to get money, out of people paying out of pocket to get all the detransition type procedures. So, yeah, the experience couldn't be more stark between transitioning and detransitioning.
So you've chatted then with people who have had their breasts augmentation paid for by insurance because they had the diagnosis of gender identity disorder, but now because they're trying to detransition and they don't have some kind of diagnosis that labels them or deems them, fit to have a breast removal, then they can't get that paid for.
Exactly. Yeah. They're no longer have gender identity disorder because they've detransitioned. Even though it was more of like an ideological detransition. They just realized that they were lied to about biology, basically, and that they couldn't actually change their sex. But because, they don't meet the strict requirements now of gender identity disorder, they just treat them as just a normal adult who's trying to get breast augmentation or reduction. So they request it to be paid out of pocket.
That's really odd. And
Yeah.
obviously very, very unfair for the
Yeah.
detransitioners out there. Um, you know, Overall, like what would you say is the rough percentage of people who are legitimately transgender? They've, made the transition. They feel like their life is significantly better because of it. They don't look back. They don't want to, detransition. Like, is that something you believe in at all? Do you feel like it's, 1% of people, 2% of people? Like, what do you think? How many people do you think out there are definitely transgender?
Yeah, it's the terminology is difficult here because people will say that, what does it mean to be truly transgender? Is that even a thing? Um, so for me, I think what makes the most sense is I don't think it makes sense to label anyone, especially a child, as being transgender as just an aspect of who they are from birth. People always talk about trans kids as though they're this special subset of children that's distinct from, cis kids and that type of thing. And like for me, these are just kids. Some kids are going to be very sex non-conforming in their behavior, and they're still just kids. Some kids will have a more severe version of, that will be extraordinarily gender non-conforming, that can produce a kind of dysphoria and anxiety that might lead them to want to transition later in life. I do believe there are some people will grow up, they'll go through puberty, they'll become adults, and they have just this, they're internally tormented by the fact that even if they're not actually born in the wrong body, they sure feel that way. And it's something that's not going to go away by telling them, oh, just, accept your body and things like that. Like, I think there is a real mental health condition that is related to gender dysphoria, and that some people, some adults, will benefit if they choose to transition. I think some people fit that description for sure. I think that it's hard to put percentages on what that is. I mean, it used to be somewhere around like 0.5% of people that fit that description. I think that might be a little bit high too, but let's just go with that. The issue we have now is that the definition of what it means to be trans has completely changed. When we talked about someone being trans, that used to refer to someone who's transsexual. And this, if you look at the old definitions of this, it was people who have this, who actually took steps to transition. They took hormones, they had surgeries. You are not born a transsexual, you become one. It's a process that you go through. And then somewhere, I think in the 90s, we saw this shift over to transgender. And, if you talk to like a lot of the Gen X people who identify as trans, they call themselves transsexuals. They don't call themselves transgender. But when you look at sort of the CDC, the American Psychological Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, all of the medical institutions in the US and abroad, when they define what it means to be transgender, it is just this crazy umbrella term. I think they would say it's an umbrella term for people whose identity or expression differs from what is traditionally expected for someone of their sex. And so this encompasses just any degree of sex nonconformity, short-haired women. This is something that's not, typically associated with members of that sex. Homosexuality now becomes under the trans umbrella because, a man attracted to other men. This isn't something that is traditionally associated with being male. It's what's traditionally associated with male is being attracted to females. And so the definition has just expanded to encompass just anyone who's not just a complete caricature of masculinity or femininity of what's expected of their sex. So no wonder we see this explosion. In some places like Davis, California, the percentage of kids who are identifying as trans is somewhere between 5 and 8% of the classrooms, which is just completely out of control. And again, it makes sense if we're just saying you're trans if you're sex nonconforming to any degree. Yes, I'm surprised the number isn't 30%, because no one is a perfect a paragon of masculinity or femininity. So that's kind of where we are right now with the definitions and why we see these numbers spiking. So the numbers we see now are reflective of an ideological change that have departed completely from the original DSM sort of gender identity disorder diagnosis. And there's no safeguards in place to tell anyone that you're not actually trans. And we're using the same medical model for this new cohort that we used for the old one, even when these cohorts could not be any more different in terms of sort of their symptoms, I suppose.
Colin, you were talking earlier about, it's okay to be a feminine man. It's okay to be, a masculine woman. I know girls who I knew when I was, like a child, and they were, maybe a little bit masculine, and then they grew up and they became very feminine. And then I had no other, girls who, they were masculine when they were younger, and then they grew up and they still became masculine, but they didn't, transition. They don't identify as transgender. So how many people, or what, and I know maybe it's hard to put a percentage on this as well, but, how many people do you think, or what percentage of people do you think identifies maybe is a strong word, but have, feminine tendencies even though they're a man, or have, say, masculine tendencies even though they're a woman?
Yeah, I'm not sure the numbers on that. I mean, there's a lot of variation. I mean, if you look at the distributions before for certain types of behaviors, it depends on the specific behavior, but there's usually kind of a syndrome of what we call masculinity. It's a correlation among many different traits. Same thing with what we traditionally consider to be like feminine behaviors. I would be happy to say maybe 5% on the extremes we could say are classified as extremely gender nonconforming, where you have, males who are perhaps more feminine than the average female, and then the same on the other side, maybe 5% would be of women are sort of more masculine in their expression than the average male. This is something that you would expect to see in any population, though. This is what we see it in other animals. As an evolutionary biologist, I mean, variation is key to how we even evolved to have different sexes and different traits in the first place. Traits aren't binary. We have, except, for the biology of sex, because it's rooted in, the type of sex cell that you're reproducing. But in order to have selection on different behaviors for men and women, there needs to be variation in those traits, and there's overlap in those traits. And this is something I think we see a shocking display of people on both sides of the political spectrum, both on the right and left, somehow views this sort of sex nonconformity as a problem. We have people on the super far conservative right who say, boys need to be masculine always, and girls always need to be feminine, and this is the way you're supposed to dress and things like that. And a lot of people see that obviously as just like, oh, maybe some people are just different. Maybe we should let masculine girls, tomboys be tomboys and that type of thing. And but then on the left we see that they claim to be accepting of this type of diversity, but then now we see on this far woke side them saying like, well, if you're a little boy and you're playing with dolls and stuff, this is actually evidence that you're really a girl on the inside now. And so both of the extremes sort of have their ways of clamping down on this sex nonconformity, where I come from sort of the old school liberal background of, and I thought we were making progress on this point of just like, let people be individuals, let them express themselves however they want to as individuals. If you're, you can, there's women out there who are quite butch, who are lesbians or not, and want to dress and wear blue jeans and short hair, and it's just like, go for it. There's extraordinarily effeminate men, go for it. You do you. I just think that's kind of the direction that we were going in society, and now we've really derailed off that goal. And I think I really just try to get back to that, because I think that was the correct pathway to go down.
Do you think that people are born gay or born bisexual, or do you think that that's more environment, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, this is a question I get a lot, because a lot of people push back against talking about, children being gay, because, these are sexualities, and we often don't want to talk about children having sexualities. And I think that's probably a good way to go about it, that kids don't have sexualities until they actually get to a point where they actually start becoming, their hormones kick on and they start identifying who they're attracted to or not. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think there is a biological basis for being gay. It does appear that there is. I mean, we can look at twin studies, for instance, that show that there's a really strong genetic component to sexual orientation. So yeah, I think it is to some degree determined from birth. I mean, we know that people's if you look at sort of the brains of people who identify as gay when they're older, it's a very small effect, but there is like sort of differences in the organizational structure of their brains that is more closely approximating that of the opposite sex than members of their own sex. And we look at things, there's also hormonal differences. There's also maternal effects, like in the womb. For instance, we know that females who are exposed to higher levels of testosterone in utero are more likely to grow up to be homosexual. We see this looking at digit ratios in their hands, which I can't remember the exact 2 digits for it, but there's a ratio of how long their digits are, which is correlated with how much androgens or testosterone they were exposed to in the womb. And we can see that, females who are attracted to other females, lesbians, tend to have more androgenized hands. That's indicative of hormonal differences. And then women who have disorders like polycystic ovary syndrome, where these cysts are producing higher levels of androgens, again, they tend to take on, they tend to be lesbian when they grow up. They tend to have more sex nonconforming behaviors as well. So it's a combination of genes, it's a combination of hormonal exposures, And sure, I mean, you can never rule out that the socialization plays zero role. I mean, biology is all about sort of genetics and environment to begin with. It's just relative proportions of each, or how they're combined as someone is growing and being raised.
Yeah, because I mean, prisons, and I've never been in prison, and I don't think you've been in one either, Colin. But we know what goes on in prisons, and so because of that, a lot of people will point to environment, but then there's other times where I mean, even in my life, like sometimes there's been a kid, you can see them when they're like 6 years old or at least 10 years old. You can kind of just be like, that kid's going to grow up to be gay, and then they do grow up being gay. So it does seem like there's definitely an environment component and a biology component to it.
Yeah, and if you talk to a lot of gay people, when they many of them anyway, when they talk about when they came out to their family, usually their family was just like, well, we've known for a while. This was no surprise to any of us here. We're glad that you finally recognized what we've all been seeing since you were a kid. So yeah, there's definitely and it's usually just comes out when looking at sex nonconformity. All those studies that look at um, you know people who grew up to be gay, they tend to use these metrics when they ask the parents, uh, to what degree was your child engaging in sex nonconforming behaviors, and it's always extraordinarily much higher for individuals who grew up to be gay.
So I know this is, a little bit outside of your field, but I think it still, is in line with our conversation here today. So we know that, there's people out there who are, who have transitioned, and, that's been something that's been very accepted by society. And through all of this, there's also seems to be a little bit of like a pushback almost against masculinity in some ways, and also too for, women in some degrees to be almost a little bit more masculine in some ways. Now, traditionally, most people would say that, men are attracted to feminine women, and, feminine women are attracted to masculine men. And we know that there's a lot of discourse in younger men these days who are, not having sex, not going out. Even Jordan Peterson's, talked about before that, yeah, I mean, drinking has gone down, but like, is this even a good thing? Is it better to be alone, at home, but by yourself, not drinking, than maybe out, having a few, beers with your friends? And so do you think that society is kind of messed up also to like the heterosexual dynamics, relationships?
Yeah, I really do. A lot of it, I mean, it came about because of this sort of blank slate psychology that talked about men and women are no different. This is all the result of socialization. This has resulted in saying, that people who are, men who express toxic behaviors, we've heard about toxic masculinity. This is all because they were raised to have these bad ideas about women and other people, and girls were taught to be more submissive and docile and nurturing and stuff. This is just all completely false. When you look at our closest ancestors, chimpanzees, and even just the great apes in general, you see the exact types of traits that we see in humans, of male, competing with each other, reproductive skew in terms of males. We tend to be more aggressive. We tend to be more sexually aggressive. Females, on average, tend to be more caring and nurturing and that type of thing. So yeah, I mean, we don't have to make up any weird theories about why this is. It's just what's similar that happens in these other species is going on in humans. There's no reason to think that we shouldn't have recapitulated these types of behaviors. I just think people need to realize that, yeah, males and females, they're real. They have different suites of behaviors. We've probably evolved more or less for men to be attracted to stereotypically feminine behaviors and females attracted to stereotypically male behaviors. This is a statement of how the world is, and it's not a statement of what individuals should do. If you're attracted to different suites of characters, then that's totally fine. We tend to try to like prescribe things, I think, a lot in our public discourse, rather than saying, well, this is how things are. How do I differ from this? What are my preferences? And Those are things people should be able to make their individual choices in the dating world. You can't ignore biology at the end of the day, though, because I mean that's going to be there. It's been there for millions of years. It's going to be there well into the future, unless millions of years selection is if it's slowed down in humans or whatever. But we don't have to worry about that for millions of years potentially down the road. So if we're still here by then, yeah, I just think people need to have a firm grasp of biology first and foremost, and then not try to make any moralistic claims based on that, or try to use that as a lens for how the world should be. Let's just all, behave and marry and date and however we best want to.
And so one thing I want to ask you about that too is, I've seen studies that indicate that women always want the man to have more experience. Like there was a study done and it was like 100% of women said that, yeah, I want the man to have more sexual experience than I do. From an evolutionary standpoint, like why is that? Is it because that we think that or women think that a man who is highly desired is going to have traits for them that are going to be able to foster say just a better overall life? Or why is it that women basically always want men to have more experience than women?
Yeah, well,
Or sorry, women always want the men to have more experience.
Yeah, there's always a preference for an age difference as well, and so with age comes experience. So these things could be proxies for one another as well. Generally speaking, women, they are physically weaker. They're more vulnerable during times of their lives during if they're carrying offspring, if they're pregnant, things like that. And so age and potentially other life experiences, including number of sexual partners, potentially could be just a proxy for an individual's male's fitness, their ability to take care of a certain individual. Yeah, I think a lot of it can be probably explained just by an age difference, and with age comes experience, and the fact that they tend to be more women tend to be more sort of seeking a protector rather than someone who's an equal on that level in terms of deciding who gets to make certain decisions in the world. And again, we're talking averages here. And as I said before, none of this should be taken as a prescription for how people should behave. So, yeah.
So I got to ask you this question because this comes up. I'm sure every guy listening to this has had conversations, with their friends about it. So we all hear that, men are supposed to spread their seed. That's why men basically struggle with infidelity. And so, what's your response to that? That's something that's been studied a little bit? I'm sure it's come up in conversations with you. People must have asked you this question before, or maybe I'm just assuming and I'm wrong. But what would be your response to that?
Yeah, I think the main issue is the word should. Men should spread their seed. That's a sort of a moral claim of what we should do. It's an ought thing. Rather than, as a scientist, I like to stick to like the is claims. And we can explain things like differences in sexual aggressiveness and the wanting to have multiple sexual partners by the mere fact that we have different reproductive strategies that we're engaged in. And those reproductive strategies have different levels of risk and payoff. So in the game of evolution, all that it's really trying to do, it's not really trying to do anything, but all that really happens is that those individuals who are leaving more offspring into the next generation tend to have more representations of their genes in further generations, and that's how they replicate. So those genes that are more capable of replication just find themselves in a higher frequency in future generations. So males, we have a very low cost reproductive strategy. We can make millions and millions of sperm every single day, and the cost of emitting them is very, very low. We could impregnate multiple people every single day, potentially, if there were no guardrails and had as many willing partners as there were. Females, on the other
Andrew
hand,
Tate says he wants 50 kids. That's what I heard recently.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's potentially there's a limit just of how many hours are in a day, but you're limited basically just by time in that sense, in terms of male reproductive output. But females, I mean, there's much more, I guess, an equal spread of females how many offspring they have, because they are so much more limited by actual biology, by having to carry an offspring for 9 months. And so these vastly different reproductive strategies result over time in selection for different sort of traits that go along with them, that result in males being more interested in frequent sexual interactions with other individuals outside of a relationship, because it's just an easy way to get your genes out there, and no harm, no foul, if they can keep it under wraps type of thing. Whereas females, it's you can't just seek an external copulation and have a kid being raised apart from you elsewhere. And so we see that behavior tends to converge with the types of reproductive strategies we have. So again, we can say this is why that males behave more promiscuously than females do, but it doesn't mean that males should necessarily do that. I mean, I'm personally monogamous, and I hope to be with the same person for the rest of my life, and I don't try to seek extra copulations on the side if they present themselves, because I think there's values that we have as well.
Yeah, well, I've mentioned, a million times on this podcast, I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson, and he's obviously, very much, a proponent of monogamous relationships. And, I just got his new book. I haven't read it yet, but I am going to get into it soon. But that's something that always, comes up in conversation, and a lot of people, discuss that, right? And then unfortunately too, I think people use it as a justification to cheat, which is, morally wrong. But again, just something that I wanted to ask is, if you're my first evolutionary biologist on the show, I know we only have a few minutes left there, and I just want to, basically ask you almost the question in reverse. So, there's this, like we said, this notion that men need to spread their seed. And then for women, it's that they need to trade up. And that this is where, the term like gold digger sort of comes from. And it's because, women, unfortunately, are going to have to rely on men, particularly during times of like pregnancy, and then with caring for the child. They know that it's easier to do it with, a man than, just doing it on their own. And it's obviously easier to do it with a man who's able to provide them with the best and most resources. And so is this why we see women who have this tendency to always be looking for something better, always looking to sort of trade up?
Yeah, we call that hypergamy, which is trying to find partners who are either more physically are taller, have more muscles, whatever, have more resources, this type of thing. And that all falls back again into the inherent vulnerability that females have during reproduction and stuff. They're not able to fend for themselves, back in times when we were hunter-gatherers, for themselves. They're not the ones who are fighting. They need to be in proximity to males. And the best protection that they can have to secure the most reproductive output in terms of personal safety as well is to have males who are either more physically large, or who have access to a lot of resources that they can use in their lives. I mean, it's something that's very clearly put out in the literature, and we see this not just with humans but in other animals. When certain animals create, they call them nuptial gifts, and the size of the gift is related to the actual ability for the male to accumulate these resources and try to impress the females with these types of things. We see like bowerbirds who are making these inordinate displays with they're called these bowers, or these structures, and the size of these structures and how intricate they are with the colors that they put around it is correlated with sort of their mental acuity and how well they're able to even do like bird songs and things like that. So it's correlated to almost like a bird IQ type of thing. And these are things, if they're an actual signal, then females can pick up on these real signals, and they will evolve to identify the accurate signals as to the male's reproductive fitness as well. And so there's certain signals that can't be faked. A lot of those signals are, how many resources do you have? How large are you, and physically demanding are you? And these are things that we see that modern and historic females and humans have selected for. There's almost women, one of the things that they select for most among men is how tall they are. And being tall is also correlated with things like success in business and what have you. But if you were to predict based on just the distribution of height between males and females, like if we were just pairing on average, you would expect, like, let's say like 20% of females to be dating men who are their height or shorter than them. But what we see is that it's not a complete random selection. It's usually just like it's not so much that the female needs to have the tallest man; it's taller than them. So even if you just get like 100 people, 100 males and 100 females to select dates, you'll almost have no couple in that arrangement where the female is taller than the male, is because there is a strong selection for just taller than me, which is interesting to think about as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for answering that. I know that your most of your research is more focused on, the gender ideology stuff, but I think you did a great job answering some of the other questions I had there today too. So Colin, looks like our hour is up here now, but can you tell people where they can find you online, where they can learn more about your work, your Twitter handle, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is swipe right. It's swipe and then WRIGHT.
That's genius, by the way. When I looked at that, I was like, that is
I was
amazing.
shocked that it was still available when I got it in 2018. So yeah, so I post a lot on Twitter about the articles that I write. I'm at the Manhattan Institute as well, so you can see some of the article and journalism I've done and their website, City Journal. I have my own publication. It's called Reality's Last Stand. I publish a lot of my own articles there, specifically about biology. I also will talk a little bit about politics, but it's really mainly a Substack meant for, I guess, fact-based discourse. It doesn't mean that everything on there I think is true, but it's trying to get people to think about things from multiple perspectives, and it's kind of like a magazine. Anyone can submit articles there, and I publish several things a week over there. So go ahead and check that out and subscribe if you want to.
Well, thanks for all the work that you do. And, I follow you on Twitter, and I encourage everyone listening to this to follow and call on Twitter. He's a great follow there and puts out a lot of great information. And again, thanks again for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. You shared a lot of great information today. And of course, thank you to all the listeners. I really appreciate you guys listening to this episode. And as always, I'll be back again with another one soon.